Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm going to be reviewing well, it was aired as a television special, but it's really just basically a pilot for a TV series, and this is of course the show Mockingbird Lane. Mockingbird Lane, of course, is a remake of the classic '60s comedy show, The Munsters. Now, I got to get things out up front that I've never really watched The Munsters. The closest thing I ever really have to any real experience with The Munsters is that I've watched some episodes of The Munsters Today, which was basically a '90s I guess you could say a continuation in a way of the series. Basically, the idea was for some reason back in the '60s, the Munsters froze themselves cryogenically and then woke up in the '90s, and it really just kind of very much continued where the original show left off. But again, it was years ago that I even watched any of those episodes. I really don't remember a whole lot about it, but I remember enough of it that I got the general gist of the characters. Now, Mockingbird Lane is really a total reboot of this. It's certainly not a sitcom in any way, shape, or form. It's very much playing up the more fantastic elements of the monsters. I'm sorry, of the Munsters, while keeping them in a way kind of more grounded in reality, which is a very strange contrast, but it's one that makes for a very interesting dynamic. Now, this show is written by Brian Fuller. He's a guy very experienced over in Star Trek, Star Trek Voyager, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He did some really nice work on Heroes, and he's one of the guys between the much loved series Pushing Daisies. That's a show I never really had much experience with, but I've heard nothing but good things about it. And we also have another Brian Singer, who of course is best known for doing the Usual Suspects, for the X-Men movies, not the X-Men trilogy from some years back, and of course his involvement on the TV show House. Hey, come on, it's House, right? How awesome is that? So we all around on the behind the scenes folks, we of course are very talented, so there's no problems there. Now, with the guys in front of the camera, of course, one of them we have is Jerry O'Connell, guy with a really nice resume. Probably to at least folks my age, he's best remembered as Quinn Mallory from the show Sliders, but he's got a really great resume. I certainly did get a big kick years ago when he appeared on the Justice League cartoon as the voice of Captain Marvel. He was wonderfully well cast in that episode. So Jerry O'Connell's a guy who really does those very very solid good guy characters, and he does them very well. And that's part of why he's such an adept choice for Herman Munster. But we're going to get into that in just a minute. The person on this show, though, who really excites me, of course, is none other than Eddie Izzard. Eddie Izzard is, if you're not familiar with him, just this phenomenal British comedian. He is hysterical. There are just no words for just how hilarious some of the comedy routines I've seen him do are. And he's actually really very famous over in the UK. And out of all the really good British actors who've popped up on American TV recently, Christopher Eccleston came over to get completely and utterly wasted on Heroes. David Tennant has come over and he's doing some American TV now. We've got John Barrowman getting ready to appear later on this year on the show Arrow, which is just absolutely kick-ass. I love Arrow. And yes, I know they're all Doctor Who guys. Okay, Doctor Who is the show that really got me into British TV, so forgive me for fanboying on Doctor Who a little. But anyway, this is really just an absolutely phenomenal casting coup for this show. And really, this episode, it's hard not to say that Eddie doesn't really steal the show as Grandpa Munster. But let's get right into the sort of overall story and the characters and what's going on here. First of all, the main the job of this episode as a pilot, and let's not kid around by calling this a TV special. We've all heard about how most likely that NBC was actually going to originally make a TV series out of this, and then they sort of pulled the plug on that and are using this as kind of a backdoor pilot. That's the technical term. But really, at the end of the day, this episode is, in my mind, about Eddie. It's him really realizing just that he is obviously a werewolf. The interesting thing here about Eddie is that he's very aware that his family is different than most people. He's very well acclimated to this. His grandfather, the crazy stuff that his grandfather does, his dad being a kind of a Frankenstein monster, his mom being a vampire. Eddie's all cool with this, but Eddie, of course, considers himself human. He doesn't really think that he himself is different than the people around him, for the most part. And of course, this is where it all comes crashing down. Eddie is, of course, a werewolf. And it's interesting that, as near as I can tell from this pilot, it's not because of the classic thing of him being bitten by a werewolf. He's simply born that way. That this werewolf thing is a manifestation of him beginning puberty. Now, the idea of being a werewolf as a symbol for the transition from child to adult via puberty is not exactly a new one. But the idea that you're a werewolf because your mom's a vampire and your dad's a Frankenstein monster? Okay, I gotta give them the writers credit. That's a new one on me. But anyway, at the end of the day, it is really Eddie's journey to start accepting that he is different than other people. And really, he has around him, his family are all pulling him in their own directions for their own reasons. Yeah, his cousin Maryland, she's more or less sort of leaning Eddie's way, because for most of his life, they've probably seen each other as people who have something in common. Maryland's whole thing is that she's normal. She's a normal person, a normal human in a family full of monsters. And we'll talk about Marilyn a little bit more, but you can kind of see that she's really more out of anyone in Eddie's corner to just sort of let him choose his own path, really. Now, on the other end of the act, you of course have Grandpa Munster, who totally wants Eddie to embrace his monstrous side, to sort of realize, to basically treat people around him as cattle, as something less than him. And of course, on the opposite end of that, you have his father Herman, who wants Eddie to, of course, be a nice monster, to not let the fact that he's a werewolf rule his life. And then, oddly enough, his mom is really kind of in the middle. She's... I don't really know if I could call her neutral. It's obvious that she loves Eddie, that she wants what's best for him, but she's really not willing to take a firm stand with either her father or her husband. And that's obviously creating some tension there. Now, one thing that I do have to say is that the show is noticeably darker than the original or the 90s incarnation of the Munsters. Well, okay, that's perfectly acceptable. This is a drama, not a comedy. And just in general, dramas do tend to be more serious than comedies. So I don't really have any problems with that. But I do have to say, I have some issues with the way they sort of dance around it. Okay, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. Eddie turns into a werewolf and he attacks his scout troop. Okay. Now, in the end of it, there's a part where he literally knocks a kid in a sleeping bag into a tree and the feathers from his sleeping bag go flying. Now, if you do that to a person, realistically, they should probably have most of their bones snapped into bits. But of course, we see that everybody just simply ends up hiding in the scout leader's truck until morning. Nobody's really hurt, blah, 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 blah. And, okay, that's fine, but seriously, this has got to be the most family-friendly werewolf attack that I've ever seen in fiction. That wasn't like a Scooby-Doo cartoon or something like that. Now, I can sort of get them not wanting to show a monster massacring a group of elementary school aged children or junior high school aged children. I mean, there are obviously going to be darker elements to the show, but I don't think mass child murder by a child is really where they're looking to go. But on the other hand, it's a freaking werewolf. So I got some really mixed feelings about that particular scene. Now, moving on. One thing that I did get a big kick out of is when we're first introduced to Herman. He's silhouetted in such a way against the lamp that sort of makes it look like he's got bolts coming out of his neck. Again, a very obvious nod to the original incarnation of Herman Munster. Now, there's really nothing you would really notice about the guy unless you look very closely, and then you would see he has an absolutely insane scar around his neck. But again, that's nothing that couldn't really be passed off as Herman just being a very lucky survivor of a really terrible accident. So, and that's only to, again, someone who looks really closely at him. So I do like that. One of the problems, of course, with the original versions of the monsters is, of course, well, they basically look like monsters. These are guys who just quite simply could not walk around outside without, looking like they escaped from Halloween Town. Here we see the monsters presented as they basically do look like ordinary people until you really sort of focus in on them, and then you see that they're just a little bit off. And just a little bit off, by that I mean just enough to be slightly unnerving, which is really good. It really does seem to me to keep with the tone that they're going for with this show. Now, to speak briefly about what they've done in regards to the changes with Grandpa Munster. Before, and you understand, Grandpa Munster was played by Al Lewis, really a very good actor. He did a lot of stuff. He was on like shows like Car 54 with Where Are You? You probably might even remember him from when he was in Gremlins 2, the new batch. And he really was actually my favorite character from what I have seen of the Munsters. He really just had a real charm to him. Here, Grandpa Munster is undoubtedly the most radically changed character of the entire cast. He's of course made much darker here, and this is a real gamble I think that the show did with him, but I think it really pays off. And I do like that to really showcase this darker aspect, this darker take on the character. They went back to basically the real original source material on vampires, and that is, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula. You see Grandpa Munster form himself into his body out of a pack of rats. You see him requiring an invitation to come into someone's home. He can kind of go around out in the daylight if he wants to, but he obviously prefers not to. And, of course, he walks around wearing that sort of red outfit that is obviously a very major nod to the Bram Stoker's Dracula movie. So I really can't say too much on the fact that I did get an enormous kick out of what they did with Grandpa Munster. If you're really going to go for a dark take on the character, then I really don't think you could have done a better job than what we got with Eddie Izzard in this episode. Now, another thing that I like about this pilot is, one, it's very witty. There's a lot of really good lines. The characters really know how to zing each other, really know how to hit each other where it hurts. And this is especially true of Eddie. Eddie is very good at sensing most of the time when his family is BSing him. And I've said it before and I'll say it again in my other reviews. I love shows that have intelligent characters. Characters who are smart enough to pick up what's going on around them. And, even if you do realize that people are lying to you, if things are going on around you are not quite what they seem, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can actually do anything about it. And that's really kind of one of the problems that Eddie has this episode. He knows his family isn't being honest with him, but he can't really do anything about it until they basically choose to come clean of their own will. And even when that does happen, it does not go well. I really liked how Eddie said to his family, I'm glad I'm not like you. He's glad that he is, at least as he believes at the time, not a monster, that he is really just an ordinary human who happens to have monsters for relatives. And again, this is something else, another thing I really like is the tension between the characters. Herman and Grandpa obviously have very, very different ideas about how Eddie should be raised. The family, of course, has very different attitudes towards Marilyn. Marilyn is actually, in a way, I think, quite an interesting character, especially her relationship with Grandpa. You can tell she desperately wants her grandfather's approval, and he's just not going to give it. Now, Grandpa, of course, and he's reasonably clear about this, he loves Marilyn. He just doesn't really seem to like her very much. It's kind of reminds me of Peter Griffin and his dad in a funny sort of way. And that's sort of that's a very interesting dynamic. As much as she wants acceptance, and as much as Grandpa would probably like to be able to accept her, he simply cannot accept Marilyn for who she is, which is a normal human. So that does sort of create this really very weird bond between the two of them. And it is sort of interesting that Marilyn, being the ordinary human, really basically takes her being an ordinary human, and at least as I'm reading her character, is trying to make that her thing, even though that's the thing that really drives her apart from the person that she wants to be closest to the most, which of course I mean Grandpa. Marilyn's really basically turned herself into this kind of Stepford Wives-esque person in a way. As if this is somehow her idea of what a normal person should be, and she's just taken quote unquote normal to the nth degree, which really just makes Marilyn as big a freak as everyone else. At the end of the day, it is actually the 13-year-old kid who just discovered he's a werewolf who's the most normal person of the whole bunch. Now, the whole let's actually go back and start talking a little bit more about the characters on a more individual level, since I've just finished talking about Marilyn. Now, Herman, I've got some mixed feelings about him. His flaw here is generally that and it's even explicitly stated and said right to his face, that Herman cares too much about his family. And as far as flaws go, that's not a bad one. It's just a really, really dangerous one in a way. And I don't mean that from the fact that it could potentially kill him, literally. That's an all right twist. That is what makes one of the things that makes what they have going on with Herman interesting. It's just, this is basically, I'm kind of worried that if this episode does get picked up for a series and they continue down this path, it's really just going to be too easy for them to kind of make Herman way too much of a saint, is basically my real concern there. And there's also the idea that while it's perfectly okay to care about your family, that is how most of us are, and of course it's also reasonable to want to at times put your family's needs ahead of your own. That's, again, part of what being a family is sometimes having to put your own desires aside and let what's good for your family take the front. The problem with that, of course, is that you can't do that all the time. At the end of the day, sometimes we really do need to think about ourselves. Sometimes we have to put our own needs as individuals first. Because if we never do that, then that's just basically giving resentment towards the people we love an ideal garden to grow in, is really the best way I can think to put what it is I'm trying to say here. And, I really could see Herman eventually growing to feel some sort of resentment towards everything that he has to deal with in his life. Lily, as I've said, is really a character who's kind of in the middle in the little tug of war between Grandpa and Herman. And frankly, out of everybody in this episode, I think she's the one who gets the least amount of development. I mean, the whole thing about her feeling bad because she didn't breastfeed Eddie, I mean, really, is that the best we can do with her? Now, granted, it's only 40 some minutes, and you've got to focus in on really Grandpa, Eddie, and Herman as the main characters here, because they are the ones who are really driving the story this episode. Now, coming back to talk about Grandpa, I again, I do sort of also have some concerns in regards to his being evil. I mean, he's totally down with killing Scott so that he can take Scott's heart and give it to Herman. And of course, Scott does die this episode, but it's in an extraordinarily convenient but genuine accident. And, well, again, one of the concerns I would have is just how much stuff can you realistically have Grandpa do that is on the moral borderline before fans really just turn against the character. Again, they would really be doing a constant fine dance with this character is really what I'm thinking. I mean, he does slaughter a deer naked in front of his grandson, and vampire or not, that's kind of a messed up thing to do. So that is one concern that I think would have to be addressed if this pilot were to go to series. But, if you got a guy like Brian Fuller handling things, then I think it's certainly doable. I mean, geez, a show like look at a show like Dexter. It's about a serial killer. Now, granted, Dexter is a much grimmer show than this is, and also airs on Showtime, not NBC, which is definitely a network more cultivated towards adults. But I still think you kind of get where it is I'm going here. And one thing I do have to give a little bit of a nod out that I got an enormous kick out of was Scott actually having the little Boy Scout patches on his jacket that he wears to have dinner with the Munsters. I mean, that's his normal going out formal wear, and he still has the little Boy Scout patches on it. I mean, apparently he really wasn't kidding that the Wilderness Scouts or the Nature Scouts or whatever the heck BS name they have in this show really is his whole life. And I do have to say that the scene at the very end with Grandpa, restoring Herman with his new heart while drinking Scott's blood and becoming visibly younger, and the music and it just really was a very great piece of writing and directing and acting, and just a really superb scene overall. That one really, I think, more than anything, sells the tone that they were going for with this show. So, all in all, I think Mockingbird Lane is something that has enormous potential. It's really hard to judge too completely based on just one episode, but if this show were to go to series, I would totally check it out. If for no other reason to just get a regular dose of Eddie Izzard. But there's enough talented people involved in the show that I think that if it were to go to series, we could really have a very memorable, very interesting drama fantasy show that would actually, in my mind, be quite unique on TV these days. Anyway, folks, that's all I have for this one. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.